On the dawn of June 27, 1876, the Little Bighorn Valley was shrouded in mist and blood. A devastating defeat changed America forever. What secrets lie behind the Battle of Little Bighorn? And why did victory turn to tragedy? Discover the story of the storm over the plains. As the first light of dawn on June 27, 1876, crept silently over the rolling hills of Montana Territory, an eerie stillness enveloped the Little Bighorn Valley. The summer air still carried the metallic tang of gunpowder, mingling with the damp scent of earth and trampled prairie grass. The Little Bighorn River, once crystal clear, now flowed past the scattered remnants of one of the most shocking military defeats in American history. Across the battlefield, the bodies of men and horses lay strewn, like silent notes in an unwritten elegy of tragedy. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, fresh from their resounding victory, had retreated to their camps, carrying with them pride in their fallen comrades. Meanwhile, the surviving soldiers of the 7th Cavalry Regiment, under the command of Major Marcus Reno and Captain Frederick Benteen, emerged exhausted from their defensive positions on the hilltops, confronting a brutal reality. They descended into the valley, where their comrades had fallen, to face a scene that surpassed their darkest nightmares. Atop the hill later named Last Stand Hill, the body of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer was found, lying beside his brothers Tom and Boston, his nephew Harry Reed, and his brother-in-law James Calhoun. Custer, bearing 2 gunshot wounds, one near his heart, another at his left temple, seemed to retain a grim dignity even in death. Notably, his body was largely untouched, a sign of respect some native warriors bestowed upon a courageous foe. This scene, under the dim glow of early morning, seared itself into the minds of those who witnessed it, like a tragic painting drawn in blood and smoke. The task of identifying and recovering the bodies was a grueling one, both physically and emotionally. The surviving soldiers, who just days before had shared meals with their comrades, now faced their disfigured faces under the harsh Montana summer sun. Each body told its own story, a soldier clutching his rifle, another gripping an unsent letter home. The men worked in silence, accompanied only by the sound of shovels striking earth and the wind whistling through the prairie. General Alfred Terry, leading the relief column, arrived at the scene with unconcealed horror. His initial reports, hastily written in a field tent, reflected the shock at the scale of the disaster. "It is my painful duty," he wrote, "to report that Lieutenant Colonel Custer and his entire immediate command have been annihilated." Those dry words could not convey the chaos and grief engulfing the remaining soldiers. Meanwhile, from the perspective of the native tribes, the story of their victory at Greasy Grass, their name for the battle, began to be recounted around campfires. Warriors spoke of Crazy Horse's bravery, Sitting Bull's prophetic visions, and the moment they defended their way of life against the encroachment of the white man. Yet, even amidst the joy of triumph, a sense of unease crept in. Would this victory mark the dawn of a new chapter or merely the prelude to a greater tragedy? As the sun climbed higher, its light revealed the scars of battle. Broken arrows, scattered cartridge casings, and personal items, pocket watches, family photographs, a torn boot, littered the battlefield like fragments of an unfinished puzzle. The task of burying the fallen began immediately, driven not only by respect but also by the summer heat, which hastened the decomposition of the bodies. The soldiers of the 7th Cavalry worked with a cold professionalism, masking their personal grief. They dug shallow graves where their comrades had fallen, marking them with makeshift wooden stakes. The bodies of Custer and his officers received slightly more formal burials, though still rushed due to the harsh conditions. These graves, like the battle itself, were temporary. Many families later requested the return of their loved ones' remains for reburial in the east. Lieutenant Edward McClernand, one of the first officers to arrive at the scene, recorded in his notebook, "They lay as they had fought, line upon line, marking their final defensive positions." His words not only described the scene but also conveyed a respect for the resilience of the soldiers who fought to their last breath. Meanwhile, the native warriors had departed, taking their dead and wounded with them, leaving behind traces of their victory. Cartridge casings, broken arrows, and scattered personal items became the first clues to reconstructing their movements and tactics. The massive encampment of the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho alliance, perhaps the largest gathering of Plains tribes in history, had vanished into the landscape, leaving only trampled grass and cold campfires as evidence of their presence. The mapping of the battlefield began soon after. Lieutenant Edward McGuire of the Corps of Engineers conducted a terrain survey, creating the first maps documenting the positions of bodies and artifacts. Field surgeons examined the dead, noting wounds to reconstruct their final moments. Personal effects, letters, watches, rings, were carefully collected to be sent to grieving families in the East. As news of the disaster spread, the first journalists arrived, armed with pens and paper to capture stories that would stun the nation. Their reports, though sometimes exaggerated, documented the horror and stillness of the battlefield, the stench of death under the Montana sun, the scattered personal items, and the silence that enveloped the scene like a reminder of ambition's cost. The news of the Little Bighorn disaster reached the East like a thunderbolt in a clear sky during the nation's centennial celebrations. In July 1876, as the country reveled in festivities in Philadelphia, newsboys shouted shocking headlines, "Massacre at Little Bighorn." The contrast between the jubilation of the 4th of July and the reports of Custer's annihilation created a psychological shock that rippled through American society. Eastern newspapers seized the story with unprecedented fervor. The New York Herald screamed, "Massacre," in bold type, while the Chicago Tribune devoted entire pages to biographies of the fallen officers. These reports, often based on incomplete information and tinged with racial biases, painted vivid images of savage warfare, fueling public anger and calls for vengeance. In Congress, politicians who had previously paid little attention to frontier affairs now demanded immediate action. Senator William Stewart of Nevada thundered from the Senate floor, "The blood of our soldiers cries out for vengeance." His words echoed the growing public sentiment demanding swift and decisive retaliation against the native tribes. Yet not everyone was swept up in the fury. Some intellectuals and religious leaders began questioning the nation's Indian policies. The Boston Globe published a series of editorials challenging the wisdom of current approaches, while religious journals called for a more humane stance toward tribal relations. These voices, though initially drowned out by cries for revenge, laid the groundwork for later reform movements. Within military circles, the defeat sparked heated debates. Seasoned officers criticized Custer's tactics, while military journals like the Army and Navy Journal dissected every detail of the battle, igniting discussions about cavalry doctrine and techniques for fighting native tribes. President Ulysses S. Grant's administration faced immense pressure to respond. Grant, a seasoned general, understood the complex realities of frontier warfare better than most politicians, but public outcry forced him to deploy additional troops and resources to the Dakota Territory. Political attacks during an election year compelled both parties to address Indian policy in their platforms, though their solutions often reflected political expediency rather than practical wisdom. The defeat at Little Bighorn compelled the U.S. Army to reimagine its approach to frontier warfare. The loss of an entire battalion to native forces was an unacceptable humiliation, demanding a sweeping overhaul of military doctrine, strategy, and operations. General Philip Sheridan, commander of the Military Division of the Missouri, issued a series of revolutionary directives. Small unit operations were abandoned, no longer would cavalry companies venture alone into hostile territory. Instead, units were required to operate in concentrated strength, with multiple companies coordinating their movements. The image of the dashing cavalry officer leading a small detachment on a glory-seeking mission was replaced by the pragmatic reality of large, well-supplied columns operating with mutual support. Communication became paramount. The Army established a network of heliograph stations across the Western Territories, using mirrors to flash messages over vast distances. These stations, perched on high points and staffed around the clock, created an information web to track native movements and coordinate military responses. Training underwent a radical transformation. The Cavalry School at Fort Riley, Kansas, overhauled its curriculum, focusing on native warfare tactics, terrain analysis, and dismounted combat when necessary. Supply lines were reorganized, with cavalry units now traveling with pack mules carrying ammunition and supplies, eliminating reliance on vulnerable wagon trains. The army began systematically recruiting native scouts, leveraging their knowledge of terrain, tracking skills, and understanding of tribal warfare. Weaponry evolved, with repeating rifles replacing single-shot carbines, reflecting lessons from the superior firepower of native warriors. Officers were trained to construct field fortifications quickly, a lesson drawn from Reno's men desperately digging in with tin cups and bare hands. Frontier posts were consolidated into larger, strategically positioned installations, controlling key terrain and water sources. Military campaigns began accounting for environmental factors like weather and seasonal patterns, avoiding the mistakes of Custer's ill-fated expedition. Though some old guard officers resisted these changes, the memory of Little Bighorns cost silence dissent. These reforms marked the end of the Romantic era of frontier cavalry warfare, ushering in a more systematic, professional approach that would influence American military doctrine into the 20th century. The victory at Little Bighorn, though a glorious moment for the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, became the prelude to tragedy. As the summer of 1876 faded into autumn, the great tribal alliance began to fracture under the weight of an unprecedented military response. Sitting Bull, who had foreseen the victory in a vision, watched his coalition unravel. The massive encampment at Little Bighorn could not be sustained amid intensified military pursuit. Buffalo hunting grew dangerous, and food supplies dwindled. General Nelson Miles' winter campaign, with better-equipped troops, denied the tribe safe havens. Crazy Horse, the tactical genius of the battle, found his options narrowing. Constant movement to evade military columns made gathering food impossible. Children and elders suffered starvation and exposure during the brutal winter of 1876–77. Some bands resorted to eating their horses, a desperate act that struck at the heart of Plains culture and mobility. Gradually, smaller groups broke away from the alliance, some fleeing to Canada, others surrendering to reservations. The Army's strategy of division weakened the tribes, forcing them to choose between resistance and survival. Reservation life was a humiliation. Warriors once free on the plains now depended on government rations and answered to white agents. Traditional ceremonies were banned, medicine men persecuted, and spiritual life suppressed. The Ghost Dance movement, a desperate attempt to restore the old ways, ended in tragedy at Wounded Knee in 1890. The landscape itself transformed. Buffalo herds were decimated, and prairies were carved up by railroads and settlements. The victory at Little Bighorn, rather than preserving their way of life, hastened its demise. Yet, amid this loss, the spirit of resistance and cultural preservation found new expressions, becoming a symbol of resilience in the difficult years that followed.